Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call to order this regularly scheduled Intergovernmental Relations Committee meeting on September 25th. I'm the chair of the committee, Councilmember Johnson, and I'm joined today by a quorum of our committee members, Councilmember Schrader, Vice President Jenkins, and Councilmember Reich. And before us today, we have two items for discussion on our agenda. The first is a 2040 long-range comprehensive plan for the airport, and the second is our regular legislative updates. So with that, Mr. Ranieri, let's talk about the comp plan.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, before we go to the comp plan, can I introduce our new staff person?
Oh, yes, wonderful. Please do.
Okay. Mr. Fatima Moore joined us about a month ago. A month ago? Just about a month ago, and I'll turn it over to her to say a few things.
Excellent. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair members. Fatima Moore, actually my 5th week officially with the IGR committee, and I'm excited to be working closely with you all. Ask me any questions. You know my email and number. Please reach out to me whenever I can be of support to you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Welcome to the team. We're excited to have you, and looking forward to all the great work ahead. Thanks. Wonderful. All right, Mr. Ranieri. Oh, it's Olsen. Welcome.
Mr. Chair, committee members, good afternoon. I'm Lauren Olsen, Government Relations Representative. I'd like to introduce our speakers who have joined us here to talk about the Metropolitan Airports Commission and the long-term comp plan for MSP. I will introduce them, and I want to say a few things about kind of the history behind how this plan, the timeline got a little bit, there was some unusual activity when we were doing the last plan. I'd like to briefly talk about that before I turn it over to these guys. But I want to introduce those folks who are present here today. So we have Dana Nelson here as the Director of Stakeholder Engagement. Neil Ralston is airport planner, the lead planner working on this project. Naomi Pesky is in the audience. She's the Vice President of Strategy and Stakeholder Engagement. And Brad Jufer is also here, Manager of Community Relations with MAC. So thank you all for being here.
Great. Yes, thank you.
Do you maybe want to take a seat for just a moment? So I just wanted to briefly remind you about kind of some of the unusual history recently with the long-term comp plan process for the airport. We were working, the long-term comp plans for the airport are required to be completed every 5 years. And we were working on the last one, the 2035 comp plan, when in July of 2015, the FAA suspended the use of certain runways at MSP Airport. And they just said you can no longer use the airport in the same manner that you have been, because we want to make sure we're properly mitigating a potential risk that exists here and at other airports where there's the similar configuration. So there was, this was a pretty significant change to what we were used to in terms of how the airspace was used. So at the time, Minneapolis and some legislators said, well, we're not sure what the impact is, and we're right in the throes of the long-term comp plan. We're about to meet with the community next month about noise expectations and runway use, and we weren't sure what the runway use was going to be as a result of this. So initially, we asked the MAC to just delay it for 60 days while the FAA kind of responded to this change. And initially, MAC, the commission didn't want to do that, but the MAC Noise Office and FAA actually came back to the full commission and said, you know, we think there is value in sorting this out, but it will take a little bit longer than that, maybe 6 months to sort this out. Well, long story short, it took ended up taking a lot longer than that, and essentially everybody kind of acquiesced as the FAA kept reporting back on the work they were doing. So as a result, the 2035 plan did not get completed on schedule, and then everybody basically decided, let's move into the timetable of the 2040 plan, and that's what we're doing. The FAA has now determined that they think they're pretty settled in terms of responding to that runway suspension. So it is interesting because there have been some subtle changes that did result from that. In many ways, what they've done kind of mirrors what had been done in the past, but it turns out there are subtle changes, like an increase in a south flow, which means more arrivals for us and a little bit fewer departures. And then interestingly enough, some of the most impactful parts affected Egan residents because the runway affecting them got used more as a result. So it turns out there were some things worth looking at. But now we're ready to move forward. And so I want to thank our guests from MAC coming here to speak to us. And Ms. Nelson and Mr. Olsen will share their presentation. Are there any questions for me on that?
No? Thank you for that
Thank you
overview.
very much.
That's great. Welcome.
All right. Well, good afternoon, Chair and committee members. I am Neil Ralston, Airport Planner for the MAC, here with my colleague Dana Nelson to provide an update about the status of our long-term planning effort for MSP Airport. I'll start with a general overview of our planning process, and then Dana will talk about our stakeholder engagement efforts, and finally I'll provide some additional insight about the study elements that are currently underway. By means of an introduction, the MSP long-term plan is a forward-looking visioning tool that studies facility and infrastructure needs based on projected 20-year demand levels. The plan will focus on evaluating when facility improvements are needed to accommodate projected demand in a manner that is safe, efficient, orderly, and cost-effective. The plan does not authorize construction or improvements to facilities, nor does it serve as the basis for determining eligibility for our noise mitigation programs. Rather, it helps the MAC better understand and plan for future facility needs. We've established 3 overarching goals for the MSP long-term plan. They are, first, to plan for future facilities that will meet projected passenger activity levels in a manner that maintains and enhances customer service while facilitating a seamless experience. Second is to produce a development plan that positions the MAC to meet future demand levels, enhance financial strength, leverage environmental stewardship, and infuse sustainable thinking along the way. And third is to conduct the planning process in a manner that includes meaningful stakeholder engagement. Our planning process will take us through several phases. It starts with an inventory to document our existing facilities and aviation activity levels that establish our baseline conditions. Next, we will forecast aviation activity levels for 5-year increments between the years 2020 and 2040. Then we'll determine any facility deficiency gaps between the baseline and our desired future conditions based on forecasted activity levels, or in other words, perform a gap analysis. After the gap analysis is complete, we'll develop and evaluate alternative means to remedy any facility deficiencies that are identified throughout the process. After alternatives are analyzed, we'll determine a proposed development program, funding program, and implementation strategy to present both to the MAC board and to the community. And finally, we'll prepare an overview of factors that should be considered when determining what level of environmental review is needed to implement the plan. We initiated work on the long-term plan earlier this year with an early emphasis on 3 components: establishing baseline conditions, initiating the first phase of an airfield capacity study, and preparing aviation activity forecasts. Based on our progress, we expect the planning process to run through the end of 2020. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dana to talk about stakeholder engagement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. Thank you for being here. I thought I would start out with a little bit of background about the Stakeholder Engagement Department within the MAC because it's a new one. And it was really started about 2 years ago when our Executive Director and CEO, Brian Ricks, created a new division called the Stakeholder Engagement and Strategy Division. And it's with a renewed focus on making sure that we're growing and enhancing our relationships with the community and our various stakeholders at the airport. And so this is the prime opportunity, right? When you're doing a long-term plan, this is a really good opportunity to establish a formal stakeholder engagement program. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of highlights on what that program looks like. Thank you, Neil. So first of all, we established objectives for the stakeholder engagement program. We wanted the program to fulfill our legislative duties as the Metropolitan Airports Commission to promote air navigation in and through the state, promote the efficient, safe, and economic handling of air commerce by developing the full potentialities of the metropolitan area as an aviation center, and assure that we're working toward minimum environmental impacts by promoting the overall goals of the state environmental policies. We also wanted to create a framework to conduct responsible and transparent planning for future airport facilities, including engagement, so that we had the avenue to build relationships and build trust, establish shared understanding of the airport, the travelers, and the community needs. And to do this, we're effectively listening to stakeholder interests and desires, and strengthening our relationships, establishing systems so that we can reach a wide variety of stakeholders, and taking opportunities to communicate the services that our system of airports across the metro area provides to the region. And lastly, we wanted the program to be able to result in a supported and documented, thorough and effective involvement process. So in order to do that, I've outlined some of the tactics that we have employed. In this slide with our stakeholder approach, we have convened a stakeholder advisory panel, and I want to recognize Councilmember Linnea Palmisano as the representative for the City of Minneapolis on that stakeholder advisory panel. It's a panel of 29 representatives. I have a slide coming up, but it represents our key stakeholder groups across the airport. Secondly, we have a series of public events so that we have engagement across to the general public at large. And this is a little bit different. Both the stakeholder advisory panel and these public events are new to us. In the past, we haven't had a panel like we have this time, and we have only had one public meeting when we had basically a draft document on the street, and then we would take input on that draft document. We have 4 public events that we have scheduled at major milestones throughout the planning process so that we can share information, see how the general public at large is reacting to it, take ideas and input from them, and see where there are opportunities to build into the rest of the phasing. At the last public event, we will have a draft document on the street, and so in that sense, it hasn't changed. And so at that time, we'll be taking ideas and input based on that draft document before we finalize it. Secondly, we have a project website, and I have another slide to give you a direction to where you can find that and what is contained on that. We'll be pushing out news updates to a distribution list. Right now we have over 600 people subscribed to that distribution list, and so we have regular monthly project updates that will push to that list. We have online public polling. We are using Polko as our polling platform to assess what the public is saying about the plan and see where there are opportunities for us to build ideas and insights into the plan. We have project newsletters. In fact, the first one just came out today. So if you didn't receive that, I would recommend you sign up through our e-news monthly project update, and then you'll get that through your email. We have print notifications for public events. We will be updating our Noise Oversight Committee and the Planning, Development, and Environment Committee of the MAC, and additional presentations such as this one or any that may be requested in the future. This slide shows our makeup of the stakeholder advisory panel. First and foremost, this is an advisory panel representing our stakeholder groups that have an interest in the planning process. They are representing a broad range of stakeholder groups, receiving information about the plan and communicating public concerns and aspirations throughout the planning process. And so these are our different stakeholder groups that we have represented on that 29 member board. We have met 2 times so far, and we have a plan to meet an additional 4 times throughout the planning process. That'll take us up to the end of 2020.
Can you hold on 1 second, Councilmember Schrader?
Oh, thank you. Just a quick question. Looking over the stakeholders, I think one important aspect for the city is just what we're doing on climate change. The folks that are really reflected in the stakeholder panel, it's very much a reflection of folks that use the airport and have really one view, and not just the impact that has overall on our emissions. Is that taken into account, or is that reflected somehow?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Schrader, the panel is very broad, and there have been discussions about environmental concerns that have come up. And certainly there is an opportunity to engage with the panel in that manner and the broader public in that manner. To give you a little bit of an update that branches outside of the long-term plan right now. We are working as the MAC on our sustainability program and establishing what kind of goals we want to have as the Airports Commission in terms of sustainability. And so it's really a good time to run those two efforts in parallel so that we can build our goals into the long-term plan and be able to communicate it effectively that way.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
I want to touch on the project website that we have. It's at our mspairport.com website under long-term plan. These are the different pages that we have available, and it's a very much living project website. And so whenever we have any informational items or agendas for our panel meetings, we'll be updating this project website. The frequently asked questions is always a good opportunity for us to take into account the questions and concerns that we're receiving and be able to use that as a tool to respond to them. And then we have an avenue for members of the public to be able to contact the project team through that and sign up to receive updates about the project. What we are able to do with the questions and comments that come through the long-term plan, we're not likely going to be able to incorporate all of the input we receive just because of, you ask questions and you're bound to get responses and answers that might fall outside of the really purpose of the long-term plan. For example, already conversations at the panel have come up about TSA staffing or air traffic control procedures and those kind of things. Because this is a facility planning document, we're not going to be able to act on everything that we hear. And so we'll be able to listen to those concerns and aspirations, and the project team is going to assess when possible, how we're going to be able to make changes within the document. The other considerations that we have are listed here, and they're big ones too. Maintaining a high level of service for our traveling public, achieving established goals for the plan, which Neil presented to you earlier, conforming to design standards, and there are a lot of design standards for airports, and so that is really important for us to continue. Of course, the safety of the airport and aircraft operations, operational feasibility, the policies of the federal and state regulations, and then project costs always are a major consideration. The last thing I wanted to let you know is our upcoming engagement. We have our first public event coming up on October 2nd, 4 to 8 p.m. at the Mall of America Executive Center. This is open to the public, and all are welcome to come. We will be having a presentation on the long-term plan. It'll look and feel a lot like this one, that presentation will start at 5:30 p.m. that night. In addition to the presentation, we'll also have an opportunity for people to come and kind of experience the airport outside the airport. So we will have some restaurants coming in from the airport and providing little taste of MSP type opportunities. We'll have some exhibitors talking about the history of the airport, the history of aircraft operations and airlines at the airport. We have a kids corner where we'll have youth-inspired or aviation-inspired youth activities. And so all are welcome to come. I have dropped off some postcards with Ms. Olsen to advertise that event across the city, and I am very open to providing more postcards or sending that electronically as well through your media channels to advertise that. For those that can't make the event or want to participate in our poll, we have the POLCO address there, the link to our POLCO survey that is open right now, and it will stay open until October 22nd. So that is also an opportunity for people to participate. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Neil to talk about the planning process.
All right, thanks, Dana. So in order to prepare for our upcoming study elements, we've been collecting, analyzing, preparing our baseline condition data sets. So what's really going on at the airport these days? For example, we've been updating all of our terminal floor plans to reflect current conditions. It's no small task as our facilities are in a constant state of change, which you know if you've been to the airport lately. Our planning team has also spent time in the terminals and outside on the curb fronts, observing passenger activities, collecting data, and conducting surveys. to refresh our understanding of passenger attributes and trends. This type of data will help us fine-tune the inputs into our upcoming simulation modeling and refine our level of service standards that will be used to evaluate how our facilities are performing based on forecasted demand. And speaking of demand, leads us to our aviation activity forecasting exercise. The forecasting process is a collaborative effort between MAC staff and our consulting partners at Recondo and Associates, with input being received from our airline partners. The objective for our forecast is to develop a likely range of demand scenarios for aviation services in a manner that will facilitate a meaningful evaluation of our facility performance. So to be effective, our forecast should be constructed with an appropriate level of detail to inform the development of facilities, provide a reasonable range of possible activity outcomes considering the inherent uncertainty in projecting into the future, and engaging stakeholders to provide insights and input into our forecast development. So put another way, we are seeking to predict aviation activity levels that will occur naturally over time as our region and state continues to grow and prosper. Now, the airport itself does not generate demand, and the plan will not represent a build it and they will come strategy. Rather, it'll be a plan to uphold the level of service expectations we have from the traveling public. Our forecast uses 2018 as our baseline year and projects future aviation demand levels out to the 2040 planning horizon in 5-year increments starting in 2020. The key activity elements we are forecasting include passenger traffic, air cargo volumes, and aircraft operations, which means total takeoffs and landings. For passengers, we forecast both origin and destination travelers and total enplanements. Origin and destination travelers are those beginning or ending their journey at MSP. Meanwhile, enplanements refers to total outbound passenger boardings, which includes both originating travelers and those that are connecting through from another airport. Due to the level of uncertainty associated with projecting 20 years out, we'll be developing a range of forecast scenarios reflecting baseline, low, and high activity conditions. The baseline represents a mid-range, most probable scenario based on available economic and aviation growth indicators. The low scenario will allow us to evaluate the fiscal constraints of slower than expected growth, while the high scenario allows us to evaluate the facility constraints of faster than expected growth. Our forecasts have 2 primary outputs, projections at an annual level, and then a set of more detailed flight schedules showing what a typical peak period day looks like under each scenario. And those design day flight schedules then become the inputs into all of our facility simulation modeling. This chart shows where we've been in terms of passenger enplanements going back to the year 1990. Between 1990 and 2018, passenger enplanements grew at an average annual rate of about 2.4%, accumulating in about 18.5 million enplanements in 2018. Looking out, our new baseline forecast is projecting that enplaned passengers could grow at an average rate of about 1.8% per year. At that rate, enplaned passengers would reach just over 27 million by the year 2040. This graph adds our new high and low forecast scenarios to the baseline for passenger enplanements. The high growth scenario, which is shown at the top of the gray shaded area, contemplates the effects of higher regional economic growth than considered in the baseline scenario. With higher economic growth, the forecast model predicts that average growth in total enplanements could be more along the lines of about 30 million passengers per year by the year 2040. Conversely, in the low growth scenario, shown as the bottom of the gray shaded area, that considers the effects of less robust connecting traffic at MSP. With fewer connecting passengers, the forecast model predicts total enplanements could result in about 25 million by the year 2040. So how do these forecasts compare to our previous ones? They're more conservative. Our most recent published forecasts are from the 2020 Improvements Environmental Assessment, which we finalized back in 2013. The 2020 Improvements Environmental Assessment forecast for passenger enplanements, which is shown as the black dashed line on this slide, predicted we would hit about 20 million enplanements by 2020 and then grow rapidly to 26 million by 2030. And conversely, as you can see with our new forecast is the green line, future growth we now believe will be at a more moderate rate over the next 20 years. Along with passenger projections, the team developed forecasts for aircraft operations. Again, that's total takeoffs and landings. Historically speaking, total aircraft operations peaked just over 540,000 in 2004 before scaling back to 407,000 in 2018. The average annual growth rate for aircraft operations since 1990 has been relatively flat.
We do have a question
Sure.
or comment. Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Can you define enplanements? I'm not sure if I know what that is.
Sure, enplanements is total passenger boardings, including origin and destination people, meaning those that are beginning or ending their journey here at MSP, and passengers that are connecting through from another flight from another city. So it's total boardings
Okay.
of aircraft at the airport.
Well, and deplaning too then, right? I mean.
Deplaning would be double. Enplanements is just the boarding. To get deplanements,
leave.
you would essentially double it.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Total enplanements is generally half of total passengers. But the forecasting is typically done in terms of enplanements.
All right. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Welcome. So when looking at this graph, keep in mind that MSP accommodated about 18.5 million enplanements or boardings in 2018, which is with about as many aircraft operations as we had back in 1992, when we accommodated about 11 million enplanements. And that is in large part due to increases in aircraft size and a higher percentage of seats being filled on flights. Looking forward, we think we will see slow growth in total aircraft operations, an average rate of about 1.2% per year. That would result in about 526,000 aircraft operations by 2040, which is still below our 2004 peak of about 540,000. We've also produced high and low forecast scenarios. In the high scenario, aircraft operations could increase to about 560,000 by 2040, whereas in the low scenario, only to about 470,000. So if we look back to our previous forecast from the 2020 environmental assessment for aircraft operations, which is the black dashed line, it's clear that the anticipated level of aircraft operations we'd expected didn't materialize. That forecast suggested we'd be at about 470,000 operations by 2018 compared to an actual count of 407,000. Instead, our new forecast, which is the orange line, projects more moderate growth through 2040. In addition to the number of flights, the forecast projects what type of aircraft the airlines will use. In 2018, about 40% of MSP passengers flew on aircraft with 100 or fewer seats. That's the blue part of the stacked bars. While use of that aircraft family has decreased over the past few years, it's still the fleet category with the largest share of operations. Projecting forward, the forecast suggests that there'll be further decline in the under 100 seat category, although those aircraft by no means disappear from the fleet as they will continue to serve some of the smaller markets. Based on known airline orders and fleet plans, we expect there could be sizable growth in the 101 to 130 seat aircraft category over time, which is the orange portion of the bars. And the fleet category with the most recent growth has been in the 161 to 199 seat category, which is now about 20% of total passenger operations in the yellow bars. We expect to see some additional near-term growth in that large narrow body category with stabilization later. And finally, I'd like to provide a brief update about our airfield capacity study. The capacity study is being developed as a collaborative effort between MAC staff and our consulting partners at HNTB, with input being received from a technical working group. Using state-of-the-art modeling tools, the objective is to predict how the MSP airfield and close-in airspace will perform under forecasted activity levels in the future. To be effective, the capacity study will develop a well-calibrated simulation that accurately represents how actual air traffic is managed, predict how much of the airfield's capacity is needed to accommodate existing and forecast demand, develop a flexible simulation tool that can test how alternative scenarios affect our airfield's capacity, and provide summary results in a manner that facilitates effective dialogue with the community. The first phase of our capacity study is developing the simulation model for baseline activity conditions with the existing airfield. We selected operational levels from August 7th, 2018 as a typical peak month average day to represent baseline activity profiles that will be run through the model. On that day, we had 683 arrivals, 680 departures, and 1,363 combined aircraft operations with the profile shown on the slide. Now, as you know, the airfield can operate in several different configurations or flows based on a variety of factors. This slide shows the 5 most common runway use configurations that we are simulating. Together, these flows account for about 90% of our total aircraft movements. We're modeling each of these flows in 3 weather conditions: visual, marginal visual, and instrument. After these 15 model runs are complete, we'll have detailed metrics about how each configuration performs that can be annualized into capacity and delay statistics. We are also incorporating details related to the Federal Aviation Administration's converging runway operations procedures that Lauren briefed you about for arrivals to runway 35, when the parallels are in use for departures, along with airfield and gate restrictions that dictate where certain aircraft can and cannot go. So here's an example of a data table populated with some of the very preliminary results from our first model runs. So in this case, it's for visual weather conditions. We'll be tracking, as you can see here, various elements of delay for both arriving and departing aircraft, and then reporting out average delay by runway configuration and weather condition. We have a target to have our baseline airfield simulations complete in early October. Then we'll move into simulating future operational levels as those design day flight schedules I talked about previously are available from our forecasting process, with the simulation effort continuing into early 2020. And with that, that concludes the information I have, so happy to stand for any questions about where we are at in our forecasting, capacity study, or overall planning process.
Great, thank you. Any questions from committee members? Well, I just want to say I appreciate the detailed presentation. You covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, and obviously there's a lot of thought and data points and engagement that goes into this. And we're thankful for the updates, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
With that, I will go ahead and move that we receive and file this presentation. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, that motion carries, and we'll move on to our legislative updates. Welcome.
Mr. Chair, committee members, Lauren Olsen, Government Relations Representative. I'm just going to give you a few updates that relate to our regional work. I just thought you might be interested. I don't know if Mr. Olsen mentioned that in the previous presentation there was a question about enplanements and passengers, but in 2018 there was a record number of passengers at MSP Airport with over 38 million passengers. What's interesting is that the number of operations, in other words, planes going in and out of MSP Airport, was actually relatively low. And that indicates the story you also saw about the change of planes, which is that the planes are getting larger and more people are getting on a single plane. So those are some of the trends. I just thought you might be interested to know that. Well, today is a really big day for the Minneapolis Comp Plan. I don't know if you all had this on your calendar, but the Met Council will take their final action today. We're expecting them to authorize the city of Minneapolis to put the 2040 Comp Plan into effect. After that, of course, we'll come back to you guys for another action. And then if you adopt the plan in October, it will go into effect in November. The plan has gone through a couple steps at the Met Council, went through the Environment Committee and also their Community Development Committee, of course, as well as staff assessment. And I thought you might be interested to know that council members at the Met Council have been very complimentary to the work that's been done and to the product you produced. I know Councilmember Lilligren and Atlas Engelbretson especially really appreciated the outreach process and the level of engagement that you went through. And there was also appreciation for the work that was done to look at the history of the policies that shape the city and how we can be mindful of that history moving forward. And there was also appreciation about the way that we integrated all of our water resources into kind of a comprehensive approach. So there's a lot of positive feedback.
We have a question or a comment from Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Ms. Olsen, do you know what the next step is upon?
For the Minneapolis comp plan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I believe it comes back to you guys, I think it's October 11th? And then you take an action to adopt it, and then it goes into effect November 16th, assuming you guys take your final action. That's my understanding.
So the next step is just a vote to adopt the plan.
That is my understanding. Does that sound right? So sorry, I jumped around, but so it's a big day. They're doing that this afternoon at 4. So I also just wanted to briefly mention something else that's happening at the airport, which is that they're in the process of considering a minimum wage ordinance for airport employees. At this point in time, that discussion's been happening mostly within a subcommittee of MAC. They held a listening session this week. I attended on behalf of the city to give a few remarks just supporting their efforts to increase the wage for employees, and also noting that there's value in having consistency amongst the ordinances, and that we would ask them to look at ours, which has been successfully implemented, and try to have some consistency.
Thank you for being there and sharing that message, and certainly is the city's position and something we're eagerly looking forward to. Hopefully that passes.
Yeah, so that is now going back to that committee, which is the Operations, Finance, and Administration Committee, for further consideration. They'll make a recommendation to the full commission, and there will then be another formal hearing process before they ultimately decide what they're going to do, probably in the winter. So, and then I also just wanted to let you know, so you may recall after session concluded that one of the things that came out of that was included in the Transportation Finance Omnibus Bill, which is a requirement that the city of Minneapolis host a meeting annually as long as there is construction happening in city limits on Southwest Light Rail. And that meeting needs to address emergency preparedness, assessment of risks, and evacuation planning for people who live in the community and who are concerned about potential risk associated with co-location of rate, construction activities, and so on. We are required to also invite certain people like the contractor and railroads operating the corridor, neighborhood organizations, et cetera. IGR is involved in helping to coordinate along with other folks at the city here, certainly the fire department, emergency management. We're also working with other stakeholders like obviously the light rail project and Metro Transit. And just want to let you know that meeting is scheduled for October 30th at 7 p.m. And if anybody wants more details, happy to give those to you. I think that concludes my items. Any questions?
Not seeing any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chair members, Fatima Moore again, and I'm just going to provide a really brief update on what's been going on in the state, specifically with housing and our opioid epidemic. From the housing front, perhaps you have heard of this during session, but the Housing First group, as well as the BATSI group, released a report. They released a report initially during session that talked about the cost of housing and some of the reasons why it's so expensive to build housing throughout the state. They subsequently presented another report that talked about development fees and are associating a high influx in fees to some of the prohibitions of why they are unable to develop housing throughout the state. We have been working the city through Metro Cities and the League of Minnesota Cities to coordinate responses back to the legislature and members. And I'm going to move this a bit, but there was a Senate Select Committee group that was created during session, and that group met for the first time about 2 weeks ago. At that committee hearing, we were able, again, through Metro Cities and the League of Minnesota Cities, to present a narrative that essentially talks about the reasons why fees are needed to build housing, because development needs to pay for development, essentially, as well as dispel some of the negative narrative that were reported in both of those reports. The committee members will be meeting again in a few weeks, and RGR will be meeting with those members as well so that we can have one-to-one conversations with them about some of these reasons why, and again, begin to dispel some of the negative narrative that's running around. In addition, on to the opioid front, there was a bill passed in 2019 session by the governor to create an opiate epidemic response, and he signed that bill into law. there were dollars appropriated with that, dollars to be collected, up to $20 million to be appropriated to that, and as well as a council established. Coincidentally, that first council meeting will be this Friday at the legislature, and they've been tasked with creating a streamlined process that can address the use as well as how these needles are disposed of throughout the entire state. IGR, as well as the mayor's office and some other members, are also working on orchestrating an effort as well to respond to particularly needles that are disposed haphazardly throughout community. And with that, that's my update. If you have any questions for me, members.
Not seeing any.
Thank you.
Hi. Chair Johnson, committee members, Allison Nessie, Government Relations Representative. A quick update. As you've probably seen in the news, around insulin affordability was one of the top priorities during the legislative session, particularly out of the House. There is movement in the Senate. They've proposed a bill that is more in line with what the House was looking for. So we do see possible compromise coming shortly, actually. So I know we addressed that during our update, so I just wanted to bring your attention to that. Secondly, bonding tour updates. I know I gave a more expansive update previously, but we will be having our first bonding tour November 1st with members of the governor's staff, as well as the Minnesota Management and Budget Office. Right before I came down here, got word from the House Committee on Capital Investment that they are starting to plan their metro tour, and we are still awaiting to hear from the Senate Committee, but we, since they have started their tours, we are confident that it will be soon. So that will be for probably later mid-November. Secondly, something else that came out in the news today, or not today, this past week, the Walz administration released their 2020 priorities. They were insulin affordability, which may be achieved before session, gun violence, clean energy, and criminal justice reform. That's one of the first formal previews that we've seen for 2020. We also wanted to update you on our work on the policy committees for both Metro Cities and the League of Minnesota Cities. We attended all of the policy committees over the summer, starting in July and wrapping up in September. Some highlights of things that were accomplished in Metro Cities. We were advocates around strengthening the language around transit financing and putting in language around cities' roles and the input into possible transit finance opportunities in the future. We also added language around SAC reserve utilization, making a strong statement that if any reserves were utilized, that they were utilized for their intended purposes. And lastly, we added language around tenant protections into Metro Cities' housing policies. Before this, there was no mention of renters or tenant protections, so it is compromise language, but it is the first edition, so we were pleased with the outcome. Around the League of Minnesota Cities, some highlights include strengthening the existing housing and renter protection language. We added, along with the city of Moorhead, language around consumer small loan, payday loan, that was actually brought up by the city of Moorhead. They have, behind Minneapolis, the second highest interest rates in the state, and it is very concerning for them. So that's a new policy addition to the league. And then we also strengthened and added language around workers' compensation policy, particularly around PTSD. They will be open for comment from October 1st to November 2nd, so we'll be sending out links once we receive the full packages, so you guys can review at your leisure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is Gene Ranieri. This is, I want to cover the federal issues. And as you're aware, the federal new fiscal year starts next week. And unlike the city of Minneapolis and most of the time the state, they're not going to be on time. They have already adopted a continuing resolution that would extend funding at the 2019 level through November 21st. So in effect, I think they're trying to get next year's budget done right before Thanksgiving. The Senate has attempted to advance some appropriations through a package of 4 appropriations bills, but it's been stalled. The House has most of its work done by committee, and nothing has been adopted on the floor yet, but all of their appropriations bills have been moving towards the floor of the House. Some highlights in the Senate, they are actually putting more money into the HUD programs, particularly more money for lead reduction for healthy homes, and also a small increase in many of the programs that we administer here in the city, community development, block grant, and the home program. One of the major items this summer has been the whole issue of rules, regulations, and executive orders. The major rule that goes into effect on October 15th is the so-called public charge rule, which would impact a small number of folks who are applying for entry into our country, who are trying to change their status to permanent status or green card, things of that nature. It would apply prospectively past the 15th of October. It may apply to a small number of folks, but it has big impact. And the impact is because there's been so many things talked about the charge rule, and it's now going to apply to public housing, Section 8, the SNAP program, and it does not apply to free and reduced lunch. But there's so much miscommunication in the communities that people aren't sure, and many people aren't applying for some of the programs they can actually apply for and not be impacted by the charge rule. The state of Minnesota last week had a meeting with 6 of their agencies who are working together to try and get information out to communities, to cities, counties, explaining what the charge rule is, what it applies to and doesn't apply to. And hopefully that information will be out soon and we'll get it to you. The other issue, of course, is transportation. That's at the federal level. And there's been some increases, but again, we don't see very much.
We have a question or comment from Councilmember Warsame.
Yeah, my question is regarding the public charge. So somebody who lives in public housing, who has a green card, does it impact them applying for citizenship?
Mr. Chairman, I will check with Ms. Rivera on this, but it's my understanding that this would be prospective. And if the person has a green card and is not changing their status, it wouldn't impact them. And that's some of the things we need to clear up because people are really concerned. Or if you have a green card and you have kids in school and they're getting free and reduced lunch, does that impact? We don't think so.
Thank you.
And of course, this will probably be litigated. We expect the lawsuits to come probably on the 16th of October. Mr. Chairman, that covers it for the day, and we'll stand for any questions.
Great. Thank you so much for the presentation and all these updates across many different levels here. Any questions from committee members? Not seeing any, so I'll go ahead and move that we receive and file that item. All those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. And with that, we've concluded the meetings, or this committee's business, so our meeting is adjourned. Thanks.